Welcome to Cardio Radio, a podcast of the Ohio Cardiovascular and Diabetes Health Collaborative, also known as Cardio. This is Dr. Michael Constant from the Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine, and I serve as the principal investigator for Cardio, a statewide network of Ohio's 7 medical schools. Cardio is funded by the Ohio Department of Medicaid and shares best practices to improve cardiovascular health, diabetes outcomes, and to eliminate health disparities in Ohio's Medicaid population. The opinions and recommendations in this podcast are those of the presenters and not those of Cardio and its sponsors, and are not intended to be a substitute for medical advice. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast.
Hello, I'm Dr. Trygve Dolber, Assistant Professor of Psychiatry and Internal Medicine at Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine and Interim Medical Director of Addiction Recovery Services at University Hospitals in Cleveland, Ohio. In this podcast, we will explore the impact of cannabis use on physical health as related to the heart. We will discuss the landscape of cannabis use, diagnosis of a use disorder, various risks and treatments, and of course, how to have these conversations with patients. With me today are Dr. Leah Sera and Dr. Jerrold Leiken. Dr. Sera is an associate professor at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy and was the inaugural program director for the school's Master of Science in Medical Cannabis Science and Therapeutics program. Dr. Leiken is a former medical director of the Illinois Poison Control Center and medical director of United States Drug Testing Laboratory. He's currently an adjunct clinical professor in the Division of Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences and the Occupational Environmental Medicine Service of UI Health at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Welcome to you both. I appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise with us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Happy to be here.
I'm excited to have a conversation about this topic, especially because, as we all know, recreational marijuana use was recently legalized by the state of Ohio. Even in my addiction clinic, many patients don't see cannabis use as a cause for concern. And honestly, why would they? It's clearly becoming more and more culturally acceptable. So I want to frame our discussion around how we have these conversations with patients. So, for example, once I find out a patient is using cannabis, what's the next question I should ask them?
Well, the first thing is you must know where they're getting it. In Illinois, there are basically 3 cannabis industries. I suspect this is also true in Ohio. One is a legal market, which is regulated medical recreational cannabis industry and taxed heavily. Mm-hmm. 2 is the illicit or black market, which makes up about 45 to 46% of all sales in Illinois. And 3 is what we can call the gray market, which is the unregulated hemp industry, which would be products with Delta-9 THC concentrations under 0.3%, but Delta-8 and Delta-10 THC are not regulated and can be very high in these products.
Jerry, I'm glad you brought that up right away. I keep hearing patients tell me about like Delta-8. What are the deltas?
Great. I'm going to jump in here and give a mini chemistry lesson because that's what you get for having a pharmacist on the show. So tetrahydrocannabinol is called Delta-9 THC because of its chemical structure. And specifically, there is a carbon-carbon double bond at the 9 position on the ring that makes up part of its molecular structure. Delta-9 THC is the version or isomer of THC that we all associate with the intoxicating effects of cannabis. A Delta-8 THC is another isomer of THC, but the carbon-carbon double bond is in a different place on the ring in the 8 position. And it's not important why they're called the 9 and 8 positions for our purposes here. But to get at your point, how are patients getting access to all of this Delta-8 THC? Well, it's typically made by doing chemical reactions on hemp-derived cannabidiol or CBD. And there's this legal loophole in the 2018 Farm Bill that means that products made from hemp, which is that cannabis that has very little Delta-9 THC, are legal. And that's why patients can access these products in gas stations and smoke shops outside the legal regulated state cannabis market.
Oh man, so it's like they're reverse engineering the hemp to increase the concentration of THC. Essentially, they're adding back in the intoxicating effects, and that process has become its own industry. All right, so say I have the conversation with my patient. I found out where they're getting it from. I know a little bit more about the source. What's the next thing I want to know from them?
Well, you want to ask what products they are using, focusing on the concentrations of cannabinoids. The most common cannabinoids in products sold in state markets are THC and CBD. And if they don't know the specific concentrations, try asking if the products are high THC or high CBD or balanced THC CBD products. And you can also ask about the product type, whether it is inhaled, if it's an oral tincture, if it's an edible product. And then again, where are they getting these products? The legal market, the illicit or black market, the gray market, or are they cultivating them at home? And ask about frequency of use.
This is where there's a difference how we think about quantifying the use of cannabis, which can be problematic. You got to remember that the things we're used to quantifying, such as alcohol or tobacco use, these are FDA regulated. We have all sorts of studies based on numbers or packs of cigarettes and charts to help you know the definition of one drink as related to driving under intoxication or DUI. But if a patient tells you how much of what type of cannabis they're using from a dispensary, you still really don't know how much is in their system. The only way that you can know enough to guide them is to get what's called a carboxy THC level, which is in the urine. Based on my experience in toxicology, I tell patients that a carboxy THC concentration over 100 nanograms per milliliter on a drug test in the urine puts them at risk for toxicity.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I know in my hospital system, our standard drug screen will reflex to a carboxy THC if the screen's positive for cannabis. I've seen those levels and I know I get a lot that are over 100, but beyond that, I wasn't really sure what to do with them. So how do you interpret those levels?
Well, a positive urine drug screen for the THC metabolite carboxy THC indicates that the individual has used THC. And it doesn't give us information about the route, the source, or the timing of exposure, or the dose, whether it was an intentional or accidental ingestion, and whether the individual is acutely impaired. For example, it won't tell you the difference between THC in regulated or illicit cannabis and whether it's Delta 8 or Delta 9 THC from hemp.
Mm-hmm.
It used to be that a single smoke joint, which was about approximately 25 milligrams, gave you roughly 45 nanograms per milliliter of carboxy THC in the urine. By the way, vaping may give you a little bit more than that, but that doesn't really mean much anymore. These products are becoming more and more synthetic, and the potency is much, much higher.
Yeah. Okay. So I do want to know what the risks are at levels over 100. First, though, what about delivery methods? Since you brought up all the different types of delivery, I'll have patients say something like, oh, it's fine. I'm just taking a half a gummy at bedtime or something like that. What does that mean, having a gummy?
Well, that's one of the problems with edible formulations like gummies or baked goods. We don't know that the cannabinoids are uniformly distributed throughout the product. And that means that half a gummy is a very imprecise way of reporting THC doses. And it's even harder to judge dosing with inhaled formulations. When advising medical cannabis patients, orally administered formulations like oils or capsules are preferred because it is easier to measure out the doses compared to inhaled, edible, or topical routes of administration.
And in Illinois, at least, we keep running into the issue of regulation. I can't conclusively answer a question about delivery method because without greater regulation, I don't really know what's going into each type of product. And oftentimes, I might add, the labeling is inadequate.
As with all things related to cannabis in the U.S., the labeling requirements vary by state. All states with legal cannabis markets require that the labels include at least the amount of THC in the product. But after that, states differ as to whether they include things like the amount of other cannabinoids, like CBD, whether they include safety information. Most states also require that consumers have access to a certificate of analysis, and a certificate of analysis describes the cannabinoid and terpene profile of the products, as well as levels of contaminants like heavy metals, microbes, and pesticides. However, states differ as to what is required in terms of testing cannabis products for safety.
You mentioned topicals not being one of the ones that are more easy to quantify. What about topical CBD? I have patients telling me they're just using the CBD like a cream for pain relief or something.
Well, there are theoretically no psychogenic effects, but again, there isn't enough quality control with these products. I don't know what herbicides or pesticides might be contaminating that topical cream, and there may be active THC in these topical creams.
Mm.
Yeah, that's true. And of the different cannabinoids, THC is the most commonly studied for both therapeutic effects and harms. But there is a lot more interest, as you're seeing, in CBD right now. And that's because it's not intoxicating. And there are a number of ongoing studies exploring the use of CBD to treat medical conditions like insomnia, anxiety, depression, pain, symptoms related to autism spectrum disorder, and others.
Yeah, with the CBD cream, that patient actually had, pretty significant carboxy THC levels. So I see what you're saying. You don't even know if there's THC in there. And yeah, there's promise for the future, but the regulation right now is really getting in the way. And the whole situation is kind of messy. So I'm glad we're having this conversation. Clearly, there are a lot of unknowns we have to find a way to work with in our clinic. So at this point in a conversation with the patient, I'll know what they're using. I'll know how much they're using, or to the best guess that I can get without a level if they don't want to provide one. But next, I'd want to know if I need to do anything about it. So in other words, just like with alcohol, are they using enough cannabis to damage their health, or could they have an addiction disorder?
When you're asking about problematic cannabis use, you're looking for the same indicators as you would for any substance use disorder. So specifically, you're looking for cannabis use that is compulsive, with loss of control, and continued use despite adverse consequences. Cannabis use disorder is more likely with more frequent use, and use at a younger age is also a risk factor. What's really important, though, I think, is how you ask. Make sure that you're approaching this conversation in a non-judgmental way. And sometimes that means that we have to examine our own biases related to cannabis first.
Absolutely. As for levels, in my experience, carboxy THC urinary concentrations over 100 nanograms per milliliter may be at some risk for adverse effects, while urinary carboxy THC levels over 500 nanograms per milliliter are at a heightened risk.
Okay, yeah, I agree. You really have to be careful in how you're approaching it, not sound like you're scolding someone unless you really think that's what they'll respond to. Let's talk about those risks and adverse effects a bit more. So what are the risks you were alluding to, Jerry, at carboxy THC levels over 100?
Well, first of all, don't forget to educate patients on legal and safety risk, increased risk for being involved in an accident and impairment, for example. Just because a substance is legalized for use, most people don't realize what restrictions are still in place. Department of Transportation or DOT guidelines place a urinary carboxy THC level over 15 nanograms per milliliter as a violation. Certainly, in an occasional user, urinary carboxy THC levels over 100 nanograms per milliliters indicate recent use, usually within hours. It is generally accepted that impairment due to one cannabis dose lasts for about or approximately 14 hours in an occasional user, but there's no predictability with precision as to duration of impairment due to the complicated metabolism of cannabis with multiple metabolites, unlike alcohol, which has one metabolite and follows zero order or Michaelis-Menten kinetics and metabolizes consistently at a level of approximately 10 to 30 milligrams per deciliter per hour.
Okay. Yeah, and I do happen to know for our listeners, the cutoff is the same in Ohio. So if your carboxy THC levels are over 15, that's a DUI here. Patients need to know that. So should we recommend patients not drive for at least 14 hours after a single use? I mean, what kind of specific guidance should we be giving them?
Well, like I said, there's no precision here to guide our recommendations. I don't think we give them informed advice, which is a major part of the problem.
So maybe I would just make my patient aware, hey, it's impossible to know how long this is going to stay in your system. And there's going to be a risk that you're taking, and it's hard for me to predict when it would be safe for you to drive. So what about the medical risks?
Regardless of state laws and regardless of whether cannabis use is medical or non-medical, it's important to know that there are potential drug interactions associated with cannabis use. Cannabis or cannabinoids are metabolized by the hepatic cytochrome P450 system. So there's the risk of pharmacokinetic interactions, where cannabis can either increase or decrease the concentration of other drugs. And that can lead to supratherapeutic concentrations and toxicity of some drugs, or it could lead to subtherapeutic concentrations and diminished effects of drugs. An example of this pharmacokinetic drug-drug interaction is the interaction of cannabinoids and warfarin, which is a blood thinner, and that's been reported to increase warfarin levels, leading to an increased international normalized ratio, or INR, and bleeding in some cases. And you can also have pharmacodynamic interactions where the physiological effect of the drugs affects the action or effects of other drugs. And one example of this is the sedating effects of THC, which can exacerbate the effects of other sedating drugs like benzodiazepines or alcohol.
Yeah, that sounds overwhelming. And it makes it even harder, right? Because normally I could have a pharmacist, or even I could look at my calculator or something and look at all the drugs someone's on and check the interactions. But with some unknown level of some unknown combination of CBD and different types of THC, I don't really have good oversight on what those interactions are like. Well, okay, so what about the cardiovascular risks?
There was a recent major publication on this topic, 2024, and that was a population-based cross-sectional study of data from a very large survey called the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Study in the U.S. It took results from the study from 2016 to 2020 and found that the prevalence of daily cannabis use among about 434,000 respondents in the study was 4%, and the prevalence of occasional cannabis use was 7%. And the study found that daily cannabis use is associated with an increased risk for coronary vascular disease, myocardial infarction, and stroke, and that higher odds of cardiovascular adverse events are associated with more frequent use. Importantly, this study controlled for demographic factors and controlled for smoking, and they found that the cardiovascular risk was also increased in never smokers, meaning no tobacco use, who use cannabis daily. So what causes these cardiovascular effects? THC acts on CB1 receptors, which are widespread throughout the body, including in cardiac tissue, and these cause dose-dependent tachycardia, increased contractility, and systemic catecholamine release. With regard to other metabolic effects, we know that the endocannabinoid system is involved in many of our biological functions. However, for the most part, a lot of this research is still in the preclinical, meaning animal or cell study stage, and so hasn't been thoroughly explored in clinical studies, human trials.
I would agree with that. There are some other reviews, and there's all sorts of meta-analysis coming out, but the variability is high. Self-reported bias is high. Potency is impossible to assess. Dose-response outcomes are mixed. Remember the number one rule in toxicology, it's not the substance, it's the dose that makes the poison. So we do see associations between smoking cannabis or marijuana and respiratory effects, such as bronchitis, dyspnea, and chronic obstructive lung disease. Smoking and edibles are both associated with cardiovascular effects, including tachycardia, especially if it occurs within 15 minutes of smoking, ventricular arrhythmias, and myocardial infarction.
Yeah, Leah, I saw that study you were mentioning, and they made a point about daily use really increases your risk of all those possible adverse effects, or I guess toxicities. And I know so many of my patients will say they use it daily, but just a little. So that's something that I always try and educate them on. Well, it sounds like we still have a lot to learn. This makes the next part of the patient conversation difficult. What do we do about it?
Again, as a medical toxicologist, the first thing is to identify and treat any acute toxicity. Cannabis can mimic almost any cardiovascular or neurological event, such as heart attacks, strokes, seizures, arrhythmias. And of course, if you're seeing these kind of symptoms in a primary care clinic, your top priority would be to triage to an acute care area, not assessing chronic cannabis use.
Yeah, and it's clearly a mimic. I didn't realize how much. It sounds almost like carbon monoxide in that way. What about in non-acute situations? So say someone screens positive for an addiction disorder.
In these patients, you would approach this like you would patients with other substance use disorders. So with specialized care or referral if that's available in your area.
So it sounds like addiction counseling is the way to go if you have that resource. And if not, it might have to be some level of counseling that you do on your own. That's not something we can get in depth on right here, but it is covered in other cardio podcasts and materials, and we'll link to some of those in the show notes. But what about this? Here's a sticky subject. Assuming my patient doesn't have an addiction disorder, and they're telling me that they intend to keep using despite knowing the risks, are there harm reduction strategies that I can use with them?
This is a really important question, important topic. So firstly, using products with the lowest possible amount of THC. And just a little tidbit, for patients who are using cannabis for medical reasons, euphoria is not required for an individual to experience symptom relief, like pain relief. Another thing is that patients should only purchase cannabis products from legal cannabis markets in states where such markets exist. They should ask for a certificate of analysis so they can be certain about what is in the cannabis product that's being purchased, and encourage patients to communicate openly with healthcare providers about cannabis use. And the flip side to that is on our end, meaning healthcare professionals, we need to respond with empathy to reduce the stigma that's associated with such openness.
And I know that with a conversation like that, providers will want to be aware also of their clinic or their hospital system's risk management policies. So, be careful about the perception, whether it's verbal or through documentation, that you might be endorsing medical marijuana use, which could be against your organizational policy. Okay, well, I think I'd summarize our conversation today with the following points. First, marijuana has potential for medical use, but the lack of regulation and the paucity of research makes it impossible right now to provide an informed medical recommendation. So the best thing we can do is ensure patients are being as safe as possible. This means educating them about the landscape as well as the medical and legal risks of use, and potentially checking a level to inform that conversation with them. Daily cannabis use is associated with an increased risk for coronary vascular disease, myocardial infarction, and stroke, with higher odds of cardiovascular adverse events with more frequent use. Acute intoxication can lead to injury or employment or legal issues, and toxicity can manifest with symptoms similar to those of a heart attack, seizure, or stroke. I'd like to mention that resources on the topics of cardiovascular health are available on cardio.org. And I'd like to thank so much our two guests today, Dr. Sera and Dr. Leiken, for sharing their expertise with us.
Thanks for such an interesting discussion.
Thank you for having us. I enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, and a special thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning into Cardio Radio.
This concludes today's podcast. Be sure to visit cardio.org to learn more about the Ohio Cardiovascular and Diabetes Health Collaborative.